The National Museum of Funeral History presents The Final Curtain Never Closes. I'm your host, Genevieve Keeney Vazquez, the president and CEO of the museum. Today I have an awesome guest with me, Paul Gambino, who is the author of Beyond the Veil. I found this book to be very, very fascinating. In fact, Paul, I carried it with me probably for the last 2 weeks, kind of perusing through it because the subject matter was so interesting. And I will have a disclaimer that I left the book at home today.
It's okay.
I had it attached to my hip consistently so that I could read through it and be prepared for today. But I found it to be, wow, you touch on so many different subject matters that I think not only give into our curiosities of death, some of the customs and rituals behind it, but so many of your subjects that you elaborate on. We have exhibits here in the museum too. So, I mean, I could not imagine a better fit for our gift shop, but to have your book available because it is what I say is really ties into a lot of our exhibits.
That's great to hear.
My first question is to you, Paul, is what inspired this book?
Let me just respond to your intro. One thing that I did find interesting about that was when writing it, you wrote that I started to feel like, any of those chapters could have been a complete book on their own.
I thought the same thing.
And the editor was always like, we had to keep scaling back. But, that's something about the book that is important to know, that it's not a compendium because it would have been monstrous. It touches on so many topics, but each one of those chapters could be easily, I'm not saying you wouldn't really have to, fudge it or put puff material in there. Any one of those chapters could have wound up being their own book.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to mention that because you said that, like when you were going through it, you're like, oh, this is interesting. This is, this fits. And I was like, yeah, that was a little bit of an issue when writing the book, that any one of the chapters could have been. In terms of the inspiration, there's two real main things on that. I'm a collector of the macabre. So kind of the whole, I hate to equate just saying macabre is death, but in reality, yes, a lot of macabre collectors and things they collect are associated with death. And so it was, I've always been fascinated with death. My wife says that I surround myself with objects of death because my fear of death, which I'll admit to, and it's kind of like a way to take control of that whole situation. So if you can surround yourselves with things that are death related or actually are dead or, stuff like that, you might feel, although it's not true, you might feel that you have some kind of control over it, Yeah,
I always say that when I'm working with people who are, on their deathbed, I always tell the families that, educating them about what to expect during the dying process and what to expect their loved one to be going through or what death might look like. It helps to kind of soften the fear, but it helps give them a sense of control in an uncontrollable situation, right? Death is something we can't control, no matter how hard we think we can or how our medical technology thinks that it can. All it is doing is prolonging the inevitable,
Right. And what that does is different cultures approach that in a different way. That so some embrace it. Well, so another interesting thing about what I know I didn't really answer your question about what brought this about, but what kind of did bring it about was my own curiosity about death, my own trying to understand it, and a fascination with it, and then for I'm not a scholar by any means, a history scholar, but when you think about death, other than the Egyptians, maybe the next that'll come to mind will be Victorian era, where death was such a huge thing. An interesting thing about the research while doing the research of death and mourning practices in the Victorian era was their everyday life was so important, while being alive was so important to how they would deal with death, because of while they were alive, they were surrounded by death. So even though you may be alive at the time, the threat of death was around constantly. Mm-hmm. So, it was how they went to work, and, the perils there, and then just potentially getting sick, well, not potentially, it was pretty inevitable that you were going to come down with something, hopefully not, TB or, something that was automatically or quickly life-threatening. So, yeah, I mean, I learned by exploring their obsession with death, I pretty much learned just about as much as how they lived, and how they carried those rituals and anxieties throughout the process. And I guess people will say that, the same thing, our culture does the same thing. Maybe, it's not as celebrated, or it depends on what, and I shouldn't say our culture.
Yeah. And I think more to it is that we're not as hands-on as in the Victorian time periods. They were more hands-on with the death of their loved one. When they were very sick, they were there caring for them. When they died, they were there helping the funeral director prepare the body. The funerals were conducted at the home. They were in the home for 3 days. Death really was a part of life back then. It was, and it was done in such a way that it wasn't removed from the home. It wasn't, nowadays when someone gets sick, they're sent to the hospital. They're cared for by doctors. They pass away sometimes in the hospital. Then they're transferred over to the funeral directors and sent to a funeral home. And then the next time you see your loved one might be for 3 to 4 hours for a private visitation, where you get to, just sit with your loved one. But you're not there bathing your loved one, dressing your loved one, helping to maybe create their burial vessel, so we're very much removed from the whole preparation for someone who's terminally ill, the actual death process, and then the caring for their body, So I think that has a lot to do with leading into some of those fears. It's just because we don't witness it as much.
Yeah. And there's two things to that I would address. One is, you say, like, when they get sick, when they go to the hospital, odds are you went into the hospital back then, you weren't going to come out of the hospital. So that was one thing immediately. And when I say I guess I should speak about Western culture, because you know what I mean?
Correct.
So,
yes.
And even, even Judeo-Christian would be time to move on. It's, you know what I mean? Like, whereas they were like, it's, 6 months to a year, dress like this, keep all your memento moris, you know what I mean? All this stuff. Mm-hmm. It was to remember. It was a long time. It was, the grieving process went on,
there was, sexist. I always said that the Victorian time period did it very well, that grief was rendered, it was respected, and it was taken, right? It was, they were given the amount of time, they took the proper amount of time to really go through the grieving process. Nowadays in our current culture, it's, 2-3 weeks, and you're like, okay, let's go back to work. I mean, I truly experienced it myself. The podcast that I'm recording right now, the last couple of days has to do with, incorporating the fact that I did just lose my mother. Oh, and I remember the whole week, I was just kind of like in this fog. Mm-hmm. And I remember on Sunday, it was about to be Monday. And on that Monday was a full week since she had passed away. And I said to myself, how do I behave now? Mm-hmm. Am I supposed to just, what is society expecting of me? What am I supposed to do? Can I still grieve for the loss of my mother? Or do I have to appear now that I'm put together and that the grief is now, I've got to suppress it and it can't be shown? That's exactly how I felt. I did not know how to behave because I didn't know what society was expecting of me or what my work was going to expect of me a week after.
You make a great point, and that's really what they did. They ritualized it, or they set a series of, I don't like to say rules, but etiquette that,
Mm-hmm.
like you're saying, allowed you. Now, I guess it's case by case. You could have gone through the motions back then and really not felt the emotional connection, but and so that's be that. But if you did, it was actually, it was respected that you're carrying this grief with you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So yeah, that is definitely something that we could. I don't want to say we could use more of, but it was definitely a cultural difference, or that historically changed. And
Yeah, I think it was a time difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was as we began as the times began to change, as the behavior and caring for our dead began to change, when we became more removed emotionally, psychologically, and physically from the concept of death. I think that's where we started to kind of, I want to say, unplug from the concept that grief should be respected and given the opportunity to run its course. And because of that, a lot of people cannot relate to another person's grief,
Not only can they not relate, I mean, you see it all the time. And I'll use words that are extreme, but you'll hear people say, like, you got to get over it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Things like that.
Yeah.
So it's definitely encouraged. To look, you've given you did what you could. They're in a better place. Deal with, accept that, and now, or the phrase that people love to use. They would want you to be happy. They wouldn't want you to be sad. You know what I mean? So yeah, none of that was used back then.
Yeah, and a lot of platitudes are given during that time. And it's almost like that what they're doing is they're downplaying it into something that is like it shouldn't be a really big deal, right? But yet those emotions are real. Those emotions have a huge impact. And a lot of times because people are told, to suck it up and drive on and get over it already, they tend to try and suppress all of that.
You know what I think is interesting too? I think maybe what that is two things, and I'm going to make a generalization here. If a person's child dies, they're given a lot of slack. You know what I mean? And it's, I personally even would understand if the parent never got over it. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
That's always a thing. Maybe as the life expectancy extended, it's much easier for them to say, well, they were 80, they were 90, what I mean?
Exactly.
So, okay, but does that make the grief of the person who's closely related to that any better? No, maybe now it does, only because we've been conditioned to do so. But, it's also one of those things when you do have children, like when, as they get older, you become more and more in love with them. So, you know what I mean? And it'd be much harder, not to say anything, but if you lost a child at birth, that's a different kind of grief. You lose a child when they become 13, 14, 15, 16, you've grown. This person is you know what I mean? So why, if they're at 90, now if you use that philosophy, well, you should be even more in love with them at 90 than you were, you know what I mean? Because you know them for that many more years,
Yeah.
But I don't want to,
I think that's one of those things that with a society, one of the things that we can definitely do better is to respect people's grief and give them the time, no matter the age of the person that died, that death is death, right? And not put a label to it or an expectation behind it, right? Just let it be what it's going to be and respect them for it, right? I think that would be a better society, right?
And that doesn't even mean that there's, for quote unquote, anything wrong with someone who has a very short grieving period.
Of course,
Right?
very much true. Yes.
We're not saying, but just the way that person shouldn't be criticized. There should be no criticism. If someone wants to grieve for what other people feel is a longer time. One thing is, back then anyway, it was pretty sexist. A man only had, I think it was 48 hours, or it was either a day and 2 days or 3 days, and then they were allowed to stop. You know what I mean? And we're supposed to go back to work. You know what I mean, and stuff. So that might have had something to do with just men were basically the breadwinner, so they had to get back to work. They had to, they were allowed to continue to wear a mourning hat and stuff like that, but they really needed to stop with the more grieving aspects that
would have kept them from doing that.
Exactly.
Yeah. They had to get back to their daily lives, whereas the wives were given more of an opportunity to mourn the death. And I think also, if you look back then too, it was almost like an expectation, or kind of like a ceremonial portion of the death, right? For them to have this period of mourning, because there's even rituals nowadays where they will have people who are professional mourners. Have you heard of that?
Well, they had them back then for sure.
Yeah. And they still have some nowadays that, professional mourners that don't even know the deceased.
Absolutely.
But their whole purpose is to come and show that display of a very dramatic display of mourning through tears, through wailing and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, an interesting thing about the quote unquote professional mourners back in the day was that they were, ironically, most of them were drunk because they were expected to stand out, in front, at the ceremonies for days or whatever. And it would be cold, so they would actually be drunk a lot of the time. They were called mutes, actually, back then. Because they wouldn't speak, and they were hard to stand in like solemn silence during the procession, and they would symbolize the depth of the family's grief, so like they'd be dressed in dark, elaborate, like long coats and stuff. And, the primary was to be a mute or somber, like symbol of what was going on. However, the reputation of the mute was a little bit less dignified than the role suggests, because they were known to be like heavy drinkers, because partly the nature of the job was to be spend long hours in silence, stillness, often outdoors, like in front of the church. So, but yeah, that definitely thing. And now you're going into a part where the line becomes blurred, because you're saying that this showing of mourning, or this public display of mourning, although originated from a good place, became a big fashion statement, and it became a way to show prestige, and it became a way to show, how high in society you ranked. So it would become more and more elaborate, and your mourning clothes would be bejeweled with, usually things like jet beads, very dark, you know what I mean? So although it did start from a personal place, or, a place of, I don't want to say good or bad, but sincerity, to it did evolve. And then and that's how the whole, and you know this better than I, and that's how the whole business of, funerals and grieving and, became, because it became too much for the local undertaker or funeral director, or, to take care of all the things that had to be done, because now they were,
well, like I always like to say, they used to, they would have to go to the home in order to prepare the deceased,
yes,
to lay out the deceased. So everything was done in the home, and it was done in the in the parlor portion of the majority of the Victorian style homes. And as death sometimes in these towns, as they grew, death became, more of a prevalent activity for the funeral director, but very cumbersome for him as well, because having to bring all of the equipment to every single house to do that, preparation for the body. So that's kind of where the funeral home came out of, because now they've said, well, let's leave all the equipment at the funeral home and just bring the bodies to the funeral home and have the deceased laid out at the funeral home. And that's why the funeral home really has that parlor look to it, that homey feel to it. And interesting enough, that's where the term living room comes from, because that parlor portion of the home once was for parties and for lying of the deceased, but now is no longer for the deceased, because the deceased would go to the funeral homes now. So it was now just a room for the living to come and have a party, enjoy each other's company. So that's where the term living room actually comes from, evolving out of that Victorian time era.
Actually, there are people that say that was originally mentioned in a ladies' home journal. Do you know that? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the one in the ladies' home journal. This is the one that has come from the historical facts of the funeral profession.
Right. Okay. So that's where they moved the term from
the funeral, from the parlor to the living room,
right? Because the living room is no longer used for
the dead.
For the dead.
And then if you think about the evolution of the funeral home, we started out as being called a funeral parlor. And then the name changed from a funeral parlor to a funeral home. Yeah.
And what was the reasoning for that, to make it more?
Probably just, I do not know the textbook reason, but I would just think because changing with the times, right? We don't really use parlor anymore.
Oh, true. Yeah, exactly. So just
we use home
vernacular
more.
Change.
Yes, exactly. So I think it really was more along those lines. So, there are so many customs and traditions that are related to death and the actual ceremonies and our cultural rituals surrounding death. And your book does such a fascinating job at highlighting so many of these. And just like you said in the beginning, each chapter could have been their own book. But I would like to, if you can, elaborate a little bit more on your memento mori, the keepsakes of the dead, and what inspired that portion, and how were you able to dub that topic itself down just to a chapter? Because wow, that's a heavy loaded one.
That what I find, one of the things that I thought, while researching this, that I didn't, not that I knew everything, but I thought was really wild, was where the term, people try to determine where the first mention of that was, and I'm not sure of the century. I think it was gladiatorial. So they say that the earliest use of the term, like memento mori in quote unquote popular culture, but where I'm talking about is 1500s, was William Shakespeare brought that up. And he said, I think it was in Henry IV, he said, paraphrasing, I make as good use of it as any man doth a death head or a memento mori. And so that's like where, for quote unquote modern culture. But interestingly enough, the earliest record of the term memento mori is alleged to have come from Black and Syrian slaves of Roman generals. When a Roman general would come back from a conquest, and he would ride through the city, this slave would stand in the chariot with him, and he would keep repeating the phrase "respice poste hominem ti esse memento mori," and that, and translate that, I guess that's Latin, and that is, look behind, remember thou art mortal, remember you must die. And it was supposed to keep the general in check, that no matter what all kinds of praise he's getting while going through this thing and everyone's cheering him, that he needs to keep himself in check because he's not immortal. So that's how far back and how different, like the term in modern terms now, memento mori, meaning, a keepsake, right? So,
Yeah, and if I could interrupt you, I always say when
sure.
people say, "Well, what's memento mori?" and for me, I have always interpreted it as being always remember that you too will die, right?
Absolutely.
It's reminding you that we are not mortal, that we all will become death one day.
Right. And then that expanded to what people would, there was, and I know you're aware of this and probably many of the listeners, so they would, there's the famous hair lockets and hair jewelry where, that was a very physical manifestation of the person. So incorporating hair into jewelry of the deceased into it. And then there were just items that, with photographs that would be put into jewelry of the dead. So, and then there were things that had nothing to do with the dead. Like I do mention, and I even give it a photo, and there's controversy of whether they really existed, and they were the death clocks, and it was, like a small clock that had a skull and crossbones on it, and it was a timepiece, but the timepiece didn't move, and it was set to the time of death, and that's like one of the most extreme examples of what maybe you would say a memento mori, only because it had this skull with a clock in its frontal lobe, and it was on a skull and it was on crossbones. And what makes it interesting, it was almost called like the return of the skull, because unlike Gothic culture represented death with skulls, Victorian culture didn't use skulls as much as to represent death. Like when you look at tombstones from the Victorian era, that's mostly, like I could read off some of the symbolism but it wasn't skulls. Skulls is very Gothic. It was things
They
like
used a lot of like wreaths, weeping willows,
vases, certain flowers, obviously, were very, important in terms of,
they used basically more natural or nature inspired.
Yes, there was like angels,
images.
urns, right? So you would see the angels, you would see an urn. There'd be like a lot of drapery, weeping willow trees. Hands were very important. Lambs. Then there were crosses, a lot of books. So these symbols were what was used on a lot of tombstones. Whereas when we think Gothic, we think, we always think of that skull and crossbones sitting on the top of it.
Exactly.
And
but I think also the skull and crossbone has always been a universal representation of death. So no matter the language, you put that on, and it's just that's death, right?
Right.
Yeah.
They didn't say it wasn't a symbol of death, and I think that
more of a representation of it. Rather than
it wasn't. You didn't honor the dead by putting a skull and crossbones or a skull on it, and that's much more what, in keeping with memento mori, being it was to honor the dead because you were not soon to be, but you would also be. You know what I mean? So
that's kind of like goes back to one of the cultures that we celebrate here at the museum with an exhibit is the Dia de los Muertos exhibit, right? Because they also do a celebration of remembering those who have died before, but at the same time, they're also reminded that they too one day will die, right? So that's a very, very heavily enriched cultural practice of the memento mori concept is the Dia de los Muertos.
Right, and what you're saying exactly right, because it's even they reinterpreted it by what they created in terms of the makeup and the the decor.
It's a parade. It's a celebration.
Right,
It's
exactly.
a lot of
And then
colors.
there were also,
which is in stark contrast to the Victorian time periods, which was heavy in the blacks and the dark colors and the purples, the maroons, and then, now that it's bright colors and it's, trying to, make light of death while reminding you of death.
Yeah. And that's something. Yeah. I mean, and that would be that's something, I guess, is very European because, as you say, Mexico and Spanish, and then Afro-Caribbean also does, would do that, is a more of a celebration and there's brighter colors. And then there's, Eurasian, Asian countries like, Thailand, Philippines, places like that, where they literally bring the dead back out. You know what I mean? So, I mean, so if tying it back to the Victorian, it's the 180 degree of that. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And, after the display is over, we couldn't, for a multitude of reasons, you couldn't put that, and it's ironic too, because the embalming procedures started to happen during that time period, but it was also just to preserve them for a limited amount of time, because then you wanted them put away as safely as possible, for two reasons. Well, for a couple of reasons. Some of the more interesting reasons was, because of grave robbing being so prevalent, you didn't want that to happen. And there was the fear of premature burial. So maybe, that had something to do. An interesting thing that I didn't realize about grave robbing in the Victorian era is when people think about grave robbing, they think, people in the middle of the night would go out and would pick, and shovels, and they would dig up the grave and, bust open the coffin and take the body out. Where in reality, what they would do is they would only dig up maybe 2 feet at the head, smash the coffin there, and then just slide the body out. You know what I mean? So they didn't really, sometimes they would put a noose around it and, because the body was relatively fresh. So, and they would just slide the body out. And they did that for 2 reasons. One, it was quicker. And 2 is the biggest fear of getting caught, because they weren't going to get caught in the act, was and they would do this to fresh graves, was to make the grave seem that it was, that it hadn't been disrupted. So if you dig up a whole 6 feet and everything like that, it's going to be pretty hard to recover it. So if the smaller amount you can disturb, the more likely it is that you can put the dirt back and stuff like that. And an interesting way that what people would do, one of the more inexpensive ways to prevent your loved one from falling into the hands of grave robbers is when they would put the body into the coffin, they would strap the body down to the coffin so that when they tried to pull it out by the head, they would just rip the head off, and then the body was useless. So they couldn't sell it.
For the listeners that don't understand, why was the grave robbers taking the bodies out of the graves? It was because back then they would make money because they were needing cadavers for medical and anatomical studies, and so people were the medical schools were paying people for their bodies, and when there wasn't enough bodies to be donated to the school or families that would donate the bodies and be paid for it, then the grave robbers would begin robbing the graves for the bodies to sell to the schools. A lot of times people think grave robbing is you're opening the grave and you're taking the jewels that were buried with that body, but we're actually talking about taking the entire body and selling it to the medical schools. Yeah. And that's why when they would strap them and the head would come off, the body needed to be with them in order for them to complete the sale. So
Right.
yeah. So I just wanted to kind of
Sure.
expand on that a little bit more, because you and I know what we're talking about, but the listeners who are curious to the subjects that we're embarking upon, that we want them to have a full picture of that. Another one of your chapters, I have two more that I really wanted to talk about, and
Sure.
I know that we're running quite long on time, but can you just highlight a little bit on the toil and tragedy chapter, what the working yourself to death really entailed? What was the inspiration behind that
Yeah.
chapter?
Yeah. I mean, well, um, industrialization was huge, right? So that became an issue, and so as machines came in, they were and they were incredibly dangerous to work with. There was very few safety measures put in place, and child labor was when we say child labor there, I mean we're talking very young, 9,
Mm-hmm.
10, 11, something like that. So just working in those conditions um, lend itself, and the hours were ridiculous, and it was 6 days a week, sometimes seven, and it was 12 hours, sometimes longer. So fatigue set in. So there were plenty of accidents, industrial accidents, that would just claim people all the time. And a lot of places actually even had a death board, which would an injury and death board, and it would note, how many people died, and it wasn't because they cared about it. They just needed to know if they had to replace people or stuff like that. It wasn't like that. They were going to report these injuries and so that they can have safer working conditions. So the actual physical places where they worked were dangerous mechanically, and then there were there was a lot of dangerous chemicals that they worked around. You wouldn't think it, but match factories were huge, and um, and it was done. Use was with this chemical like phosphorus, and it was all over their hand. Phosphorus is very toxic, but it's a slow toxicity. So they would get like this chemical all over their hands. It would go in their food, and what it would do is it would ultimately rot away their teeth, gums, and then actually your jaw. And there are plenty of people that wound up with no jaw, or terribly disfigured. The other thing which was huge is being a chimney sweep, which was nothing like Mary Poppins chimney sweep. The kids were, the smaller the better, so the younger wound up being chimney sweeps, a disproportionate amount. Racism existed way back then too, in a sense, for these kind of things. A lot of chimney sweeps for little African children, black children, and a disproportionate amount of grave robs were also there was, because the cemeteries were separated, so there was African cemeteries, even though they might not have been African, they could have been from other countries where there were people of African descent. So those cemeteries weren't really very monitored very well, so they were dead. So yeah, chimney sweeps, they would get, and interestingly enough, chimney sweeps developed this disease, this cancer, this specific cancer, and it was actually called the Mary Poppins cancer. Well, thing, and you would think that breathing in all that soot, that would be one of the, and it was, breathing in all that soot led to countless respiratory diseases and lung cancer. But, and the reason why I'll bring this up, and you'll understand why, is the Mary Poppins disease actually was it was cancer of the scrotum, because what would happen was these boys would be covered in soot. They would sweat. The sweat would roll down into their bodies, and because your testicles are wrinkled, this soot that contained these PHBs, I believe, would rest in there and actually sit. And they would develop this thing, and doctors started seeing this thing, and they would call it, they would scroll something cancer. But an interesting fact about it, it was the first disease to be determined to be an occupationally caused disease, and I think it was like 1871. It might have been later, it might have been early 1900s. But so, in addition to being, these young boys, because it was mostly boys, not usually girls, being inflicted with, lung disease, it actually attacked their, for lack of a better term, their manhood, and then, it became the first occupational disease. And then there
Well,
was things like I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that totally speaks to the gratification for OSHA, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
OSHA now is the one that really helps to make sure that the workplace
Yeah.
is a safe place for everybody. That you don't become terminally ill or meet an earlier death because of the profession you have to work in order to provide a living. So
Right.
I think that speaks volumes. And then also the Workforce Commission, right? Making sure that you're not overworked and that that also that you're not coming to work extremely tired and having workplace accidents. So I thought it was interesting that you said that, they tracked the amount of deaths that were on the job, but it wasn't for the safety requirements or to enhance a safer environment. It was, who do we have to replace for tomorrow?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. It was pretty interesting how far we have come with our concepts in our society. I think that by leaps and bounds, if you really do think about, the mortality rates in the Victorian time periods compared to the mortality rates that we suffer today and the different causes of those mortalities, it's pretty profound that you can see where the improvements were made. If I can we skip to one more chapter?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You can do whatever you want. I'm good.
Yeah. So the Queen's Last Breath. We're about ready to open an exhibit, funerals of the royals here at the museum in October. Of course, highlighting our most recently deceased Queen Elizabeth. And so I was really interested in that chapter as well. So if you can elaborate on that one, that would be fabulous.
Right. So, Victorian era, because of, Queen Victoria, where actually her name wasn't Victoria. It was, I believe it was Alexandria. Victoria was her middle name, but she opted to go with that. So yeah, I mean, and she's credited with casting Western Europe and the U.S. at the time under this pall of grief. And it's not all her fault, but being beloved and so public and. Obviously there weren't things like social media and stuff, so there was just papers. But despite, news traveling slow and there not being mass media, she was known all over the world. So when she, when Alfred died and she went into, went into grief, the world followed suit. An interesting thing, if you want to talk about, and her death was huge, and she, it was, it was not celebrated. It was commemorated, around the world, and she was buried with Albert in a really beautiful two-person coffin. But an interesting side note is there was a and there still is, but they're a little bit more underground. There was a fraternity called the Odd Fellows. I don't know, maybe you know about the Odd Fellows, right? So the Odd Fellows, and one of the things that the Odd Fellows, mostly every lodge that had a human skeleton, a real human skeleton, as part of their initiation practice, and they would use it in their initiation practices, where that's where the term hoodwink came from. They would have these glasses you might have seen in the leather, and they have these little things, and you would put them on and they would flip them down, walk you up to the skeleton and flip them up, and you would become face to face with the human skeleton. And it was part of initiation, like you're saying also, that about, to face reality and stuff like that. But when Queen Victoria died, the Odd Fellow, there was a cultural shift that said we need to get out of being under this, once again, this pall of grieving and sadness and stuff. So the Oddfellows gave up the human skeleton and they replaced them when they could with skeletons made out of paper mache, which became very collectible now because they were like, okay, we don't want to really be, steeped in true macabre. We're going to, you know what I mean? And so so there was, after she died, there was a conscious effort. I mean, this is just with the Oddfellows that I happen to know about, but society as a whole, I think, wanted to breathe a sigh and say we need to, this is almost going full circle. What we spoke about at the beginning, so like it's like, okay, it's time not to stay, mired in grief. So maybe our conversation was right from there. That's where it started. When Queen Victoria died, Western Europe and the U.S. said, that's enough of this, And it was. I mean, that was, early 1900s.
And maybe a year was too long, right?
Yeah, maybe a year was too long. Right?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, your book is so fascinating. I literally only highlighted 3 of your chapters, and all of your chapters, I have to tell you, I wish that I could talk about each and every one of them. But since I can't, I hope that the readers now are intrigued enough to want to know more about all of these chapters that are really specific to different parts of death, but are very much woven and integrated into not only our past, but also some of our future. And it helps you try to understand where things evolved from. But like you said, we can see where things also begin to shift, help you understand some of the cultures and rituals that we're seeing today and where perhaps they came from. And so your book, Beyond the Veil, I think is very well put together. I actually really, really love the touch of the black pages, the edging of the side. That really caught my attention straight away when I picked up the book. I said, "Wow, I love the black pages, the edges of them going around the whole book." But it's a wonderful book, very well read, wonderful pictures to go with it. I love pictures in the books that I read. Kind of really helps put things into perspective, and so. Can you tell our listeners where they can get a copy of your book? Obviously, besides the National Museum of Funeral History here in the near future, where else could they get a copy of your book?
One thing I have to say is you have to go Beyond the Veil, the Victorian Obsession with Death and Mourning, because the title, Beyond the Veil, there might be 150 books with that title.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
okay.
So it's definitely Beyond the Veil, Victorian Obsession with Death and Mourning. And it's available like on, all the, Amazon UK, Barnes and Noble, all the online, places, at Barnes and Noble, the brick and mortars, but basically any place that sells books online, you can find it. But I do, either make sure it says Paul Gambino or make sure it says The Victorian Obsession with Death and Mourning. Or there are some other very good books Beyond the Veil, but they're not this book, and they're usually more about spiritualism or speaking to people, people that have had encounters, with the afterlife. So that's it.
And I think you have a small chapter to that as well, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
more than
exactly.
a small. I mean, spiritualism really blew up.
Exactly.
And the Fox sisters were the birth of, of that. Which is,
Well, we definitely are excited to carry your book, and I'm honored to have talked with you and been able to really see the inspiration behind your book and really kind of learn more about you and your strange obsession with death, and knowing that is probably aligned with many, many, many people here that are listening, that it all comes from the fear of death, right? We all fear that in which we do not know. And for many of us, death is an unknown. So, Paul, thank you so much for being my guest today. And again, I look forward to actually diving into the rest of the chapters I didn't get to dive into. So again, I hope that you have a book number 2 coming out, truthfully.
We'll
because like I said, there's so much more that to be told.
Exactly. Well, the pleasure and the honor is all mine, and I can't thank you enough for the time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me today on this podcast, and I hope that you will share this episode with family and friends. We look forward to any feedback you have to offer by giving us a review on Apple or Spotify. And always remember, any day above ground is a good one.